They say justice is slow, but winter in Harlem is slower and far less forgiving. That morning, Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, stepped out of a brick-walled community center just off Lenox Avenue. The street swallowed her up in seconds. No flashing cameras, no podium. Just her, a charcoal coat drawn tight, walking like someone who had no time for ceremony but every intention to notice what others ignore. The city's cold had teeth, but she had a jaw of stone. Behind her trailed two staffers, a driver and a junior aide who looked increasingly nervous as she veered away from the car and toward the sidewalk. Not far from her path, sitting just beyond the flow of pedestrians, but not far enough to be forgotten by the wind, was James Walker. 62, former military police, now invisible. Or nearly. His back was pressed to the wall, his fingers curled into fists inside torn sleeves, his breath rising in uneven puffs. He didn't watch the AG's approach at first. His eyes were on the people rushing past, clutching their phones and coffee cups like shields. They didn't see him. Nobody did. Not since the day he lost his job. Not since the rent ran out. Not since he sold the last thing worth pawning and told himself dignity was the one thing he'd never trade. 8 months ago, he was living paycheck to paycheck with some semblance of stability. Graveyard shifts, black coffee, and the satisfaction of earning just enough to avoid being anyone's problem. Then came the dizziness. Then came the diagnosis. Then came the layoffs. What followed wasn't drama. It was paperwork, delays, denials, a slow unraveling of every safety net he'd spent his adult life believing would be there. Now his belongings fit in a backpack, his past fit in a photograph. Sarah and Michael, frozen forever on glossy paper taken a year before the crash. This particular morning, the city had no patience. The wind came in sideways, cutting through bone. James had memorized the subway schedule not because he needed the train, but because the heat from the grates gave him 3 minutes of relief every 20. He sat just far enough from the entrance to avoid police attention, but close enough that spare change sometimes fell from guilty fingers. Still, he'd never asked. Not once. Sarah had raised Michael to believe that a man's pride is a thing you guard like your home. James had kept that lesson, even after losing the home itself. A woman in heels clipped his outstretched foot. "Sorry," he mumbled, pulling his legs in tight. She didn't answer, didn't glance down. Just disappeared into the crowd like the dozens before her. James looked away. A gust of wind sent a crumpled chip bag fluttering across the sidewalk like a drunken butterfly. For a moment, he almost smiled. Michael used to chase trash like that, pretending they were magic creatures on a mission. Sarah would laugh and tell him not to wander. James would pretend not to tear up now, but it always hit the same. Behind the ribs, never the eyes. The pain in his chest was familiar, not dramatic, not deadly, just there, like the cardboard beneath him, like the 27 cents in his pocket. He checked again, out of habit, not hope, as if the coins might multiply if counted with enough reverence. They didn't. He hadn't eaten since the morning before yesterday. The soup kitchen wouldn't open for hours. He knew that schedule, too. Hunger had its own calendar. James shifted on his seat, joints resisting every move. The world moved without him. Stockbrokers passed, arguing about margins. One of them wore shoes that cost more than James used to make in a week. "Everyone's got their path," he muttered. "Mine just fell through the damn map." He meant it half joking, but no one was around to laugh or listen. Then he heard it. The crowd change. A disturbance. Phones were being raised. Not for him, but for something approaching. He squinted. A formation of dark coats moved through the sidewalk like they owned the air around them. James recognized the pattern immediately. Professional spacing, deliberate steps, trained eyes. It was a protective detail, not the kind for a pop star or athlete. Too tight, too purposeful. This was political, and then, between them, he saw her. Letitia James, real, in motion, and within arm's reach. He blinked twice. This wasn't a stage or a headline or a debate on television. This was the woman who once sued entire industries and showed up to housing court when no one else from Albany would. Her face wasn't one of charity. It was one of discipline, of deliberation. But in that discipline, James saw something that nearly broke him. She hadn't seen him yet. Not quite. She was deep in conversation with a staffer, her brow furrowed, her hands unmoving. But he saw her eyes flick. Just once. Just enough. It wasn't pity. It wasn't avoidance. It was recognition. The same look Sarah used to give when she walked into a room and immediately found the person who needed her most. And James felt something dangerous rise inside him. Not rage, not shame, but temptation. The temptation to break the one rule he had left, the rule that separated him from the stereotype, from the cell phone cameras, from the headlines. But something deeper than cold or hunger pressed against him now. What if this moment wasn't just coincidence? What if the woman walking by could change everything? What if asking for help, just once, wasn't a betrayal of pride, but the final act of survival? His throat tightened, his knees resisted, but his heart, his traitorous, unreliable, unrelenting heart, told him this was the moment. He looked up, slowly, as Letitia passed within feet of him, and for the first time in months he considered speaking. James Walker had seen a lot in 62 years. He'd seen convoys detonate in the desert, officers lie under oath, a Department of Veterans Affairs so underfunded it might as well be a bingo hall. But he had never seen her this close. Letitia James wasn't strolling. She was slicing through the crowd like someone on a mission, and not the kind you hand off to an intern. The last time he'd seen that expression on a woman's face, it was Sarah, 3 hours before she marched into the landlord's office and extracted a rent extension using nothing but a folder, a stare, and a Bible verse. That same look now danced across Letitia's brow. Serious, unyielding, and just dangerous enough to suggest she'd ruin you politely with citations. She was flanked by her team, a budget version of a presidential detail but with more competence and less hair gel. One aide was whispering something about a press call. Another was glancing at his phone as though the apocalypse might be buried in an email subject line. But James barely registered them. His eyes were fixed on her, not because of the headlines, not because of the lawsuits or speeches or sound bites. It was something simpler. The way she moved, upright, aware, like the sidewalk belonged to her and no one had dared file a counterclaim. James's chest tightened, not just from the wind or the hunger or the scar tissue under his ribs. It was something else. Something that, if he'd been foolish enough to believe in fate, might have felt like it. She was here, inches away. And for a moment, the noise of the street faded. There was no traffic, no stares, no whisper of judgment. Just the crackling static between the past and what might come next. It wasn't hope. James had surgically removed that from his system around month 3 of sleeping upright in a subway vestibule. It wasn't desperation either, though his stomach had been staging its own protest march since Tuesday. No, what he felt was memory, pure and sharp. Michael, at 14, handing a homeless woman his comic book money without fanfare, just a shrug and a "she needed it more." And then, God help him, James remembered asking, "Why would you give her all of it?" And Michael answering without blinking, "If we can help and we don't, what does that make us?" That question had haunted him ever since. Not because it was naive, but because it wasn't. It was uncomfortably correct. And now, as Letitia's team passed, James saw the same moral clarity in her face. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't pitying. She was just looking, scanning, calculating, but not coldly, like a judge reading the room before the verdict, not to find applause, but to find truth. He didn't stand. He rose, slow, deliberate, like a man digging himself out of years. His knees cracked like radio static. His head swam not from fear, but from fasting. The wind nearly pushed him back down, as if the elements themselves were offended that he might still be trying. He leaned against the brick wall, stared ahead, and fought the part of him that still echoed Sarah's voice. "Never beg, James. Promise me. Never beg." He had promised. In the hospital, hand in hand, as machines beeped their slow countdown to widowhood. But maybe, just maybe, that promise wasn't about never asking. Maybe it was about never forgetting who you are when you do. The security detail noticed. Of course they did. One of them twitched toward his hip like a TSA agent spotting an unapproved water bottle. James recognized the move. He'd trained rookies on that exact posture. He understood it, didn't resent it. But he also knew how easy it was for people in power to confuse precaution with prejudice, and how often dignity got caught in the crossfire. He hesitated, just long enough to consider whether he was about to become a headline, or worse, a punchline. But then came Michael's voice again, crisp as ever. "It's okay to need help sometimes." So he stepped forward. Once. Twice. The earth didn't shatter, but his world shifted. "Excuse me?" he croaked. It wasn't elegant, wasn't smooth, but it was real. His vocal cords felt like they hadn't been used since Obama was in office. The guard shifted to intercept, his frame swallowing the sidewalk. But before James could retreat into invisibility, the unexpected happened. Letitia James stopped. And, Lord, that look. Not the kind of look politicians give when they spot a camera, or a donor, or an awkward photo op. It wasn't rehearsed. It was clinical, curious, and something else. Human. Their eyes met in a flash of contact so quick you could almost pretend it didn't happen. But it did. And in that tiny moment between suspicion and recognition, something unspoken passed through. This wasn't Barron Trump pausing between a photo shoot and a Secret Service shuffle. This was the state's highest-ranking legal officer choosing to see, choosing to stop, choosing, perhaps dangerously, to engage. James's vision blurred, not from sentiment, but from the sheer whiplash of being seen. Years of invisibility peeled back like static from a broken screen. He stood there, shaky but unbowed. The guard moved to block. Letitia tilted her head slightly, a signal as subtle as a subpoena. The aide froze. In the gap, James whispered under his breath, "I'm sorry, Sarah." Then louder, barely audible over the street's symphony of indifference, "Ma'am, could you spare a moment?" And just like that, the world changed. Not with fireworks, not with applause, but with something far rarer in modern politics. A pause. Not a retreat. Not a campaign pivot. But a pause from someone who had every reason to keep walking and no obvious benefit to stopping. And in that breath of silence between movement and meaning, A new chapter quietly stretched its hand forward, waiting for someone brave or broken enough to take hold of it. "Ma'am, step back," said the lead staffer, whose job description probably included things like schedule management, message discipline, and, let's be honest, making sure the Attorney General doesn't accidentally fix something the system prefers broken. His voice was firm, polished, and utterly devoid of curiosity. It was the tone bureaucracies use when they'd rather call a meeting than make a decision. James Walker's legs shook harder, not from fear, but from the ancient rage of every man who's ever been told to shrink back into the shadow while someone with a badge or a title decided whether he counted today. He should have stepped back, should have apologized, should have melted into the scenery like a well-behaved piece of urban furniture. But that's not what Michael would have done. If we can help, and we don't, what does that make us? That question returned, not like a whisper this time, but like a verdict. And James, ex-soldier, ex-husband, ex-everything, did something neither Letitia's staff nor the city itself had planned for. He refused to disappear. Could you spare $1? He asked. The words didn't come easy. They never do when you're swallowing your own dignity to speak them. But they landed like thunder. You could feel the tension ripple through the staff line like someone had pulled a fire alarm in a Harvard boardroom. Phones paused, brows furrowed. The assistant with the radio flinched, classic move, fingers hovering near the panic button as though James had just brandished a manifesto. But before the predictable chorus of "We've got to move" or "We'll follow up later" could find its footing, Letitia James did what most in her position rarely do. She stepped forward, not cautiously, not ceremonially, just forward, like a woman who actually read the city's mission statement and still had the audacity to believe in it. "It's okay," she said. Not whispered, not muttered behind a wall of jargon, said aloud, like the air around them wasn't already heavy with unspoken judgments. The staff hesitated. Of course they did. Compassion, after all, is rarely budgeted for in government logistics. But orders were orders, and her tone carried the unmistakable cadence of a woman who's subpoenaed men twice her size and smiled while doing it. For the first time that morning, James met her eyes fully. And to his surprise, they weren't filled with pity or with that sanitized sympathy politicians use to avoid actual responsibility. No, they were focused, calculating, but not in the Machiavellian sense. She was looking at him the same way Michael used to look at math problems. Curious, thoughtful, certain there was something worth solving here if you took the time. "You're a veteran," she said. Not asked, stated. She'd clocked the battered ID card clipped to his coat, the last piece of laminated evidence that he was once a man this country had proudly sent to war and promptly abandoned afterward. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, as if reporting for duty one last time. "Staff Sergeant James Walker, Desert Storm." It came out steady, cleaner than he expected. His spine straightened on reflex, the years of training rising beneath the tattered coat. Around them, the small crowd, Wall Street interns, coffee-slurping cynics, and every brand of city dweller who usually looked away, had slowed. Phones were out. Of course they were. Everyone wants a clip of suffering when it's framed just right. "Homeless vet confronts Letitia James" was probably already trending. The algorithms had no doubt sprung to life like church bells. James felt the burn in his face. Not from shame, from knowing this moment could be reduced to content before it became change. He almost stepped back, almost retreated into silence. But then she spoke again. "You've been here all week." His head snapped up. "Since Monday," she added, eyes not leaving his. "You read the paper someone left on the bench every morning. Yesterday, you helped an older woman gather her groceries when her bag ripped." "She didn't thank you." "I did." James blinked. "You noticed me?" "I notice a lot of things," she said flatly. "Like the fact you don't ask anyone for money. Like how you keep this spot clean. Like how you gave directions to tourists even when they pretended not to hear you." The air cut sharp between them, the way it always does before something honest gets said. Another gust of wind rattled down the block, and without pause, Letitia stepped closer, not out of drama, but instinct. She shifted her coat, blocking some of the bitter air like a woman who'd grown up knowing what cold really meant. Not metaphorical cold, actual Harlem cold. "Why today?" she asked, and it wasn't rhetorical. "Why ask me?" The question landed like a punch, not cruel, just piercing. James looked at her, not the office, not the title, her. And for once, words didn't taste like gravel in his throat. "You reminded me of my son," he said, "something in your eyes. He was about your age when—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Something in her face changed, just slightly. The corners of her mouth didn't fall, but they softened. Her brow didn't lift, but the steel behind it eased. And for a moment, the two of them stood there, not as AG and veteran, not as politician and problem, but as two Americans caught in a city that measures value by noise and speed. Behind her, the staff shuffled. One coughed. Another said, "Madam Attorney General, we really should—" She held up a hand, eyes still locked with James. "Your son," she said. "What was his name?" "Michael," James whispered. And for the first time in a decade, saying the name didn't feel like biting down on glass. The city moved around them again. Horns, heels, headlines. But for those few seconds, the sidewalk belonged to two people and one impossible question. What if help wasn't a transaction? What if seeing someone didn't require a vote, a camera, or a press release? And as Letitia's hand moved toward her coat pocket, staffers tensing, the crowd shifting, James didn't see pity. He saw possibility. Letitia James didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't bother to consult a focus group or call for a photo backdrop with a flag and a vaguely inspirational slogan. Instead, with the kind of calm precision that could freeze a grand jury in its tracks, she looked at James Walker and said, "Mr. Walker, would you mind staying right here? I need to make a phone call." The silence that followed was surgical. James nodded once, his throat tight. He didn't know whether it was her tone, her command of the moment, or just the absurdity of the fact that someone in power had addressed him by name instead of as a problem or a risk factor. Either way, he stayed rooted to the sidewalk like it was sacred ground. Around them, the security team shifted uncomfortably. In their eyes, confusion, calculation, and the barely contained panic of public servants witnessing a government official go off script. Somewhere in the bowels of Albany, a mid-level communications director probably felt a shiver run down their spine and didn't know why. Letitia pulled out her phone with the same casual authority she once used to subpoena the Trump Organization. The crowd, now 24 strong, hummed with speculation like a Twitter thread dying for a retweet. Smartphones hovered, lipstick-adjusted professionals lingered. And yet, James didn't move, couldn't. Was this hope, or just the latest stage in public humiliation? He wasn't sure. She'd called him Mr. Walker. Not sir, not veteran, not you people. Not even sir in that patronizing tone that reeks of pity disguised as progress. Mr. Walker, like he was still listed somewhere that mattered. He heard her voice, low but firm. "Hi, yes, this is Letitia. I need to speak to someone in the Office of Housing Coordination. It's urgent." "No, no press, just a favor. A human one, if you still know how." James remained still, legs trembling beneath him, while Letitia paced in a tight radius that suggested both authority and something terrifying to bureaucrats: improvisation. One of her aides handed over a tablet with such reluctance you'd think he was passing her a grenade. She accepted it, never missing a beat on the call. "Mr. Walker?" she said mid-pause, covering the microphone. "Which VA hospital do you go through?" James blinked. "Manhattan VA," he replied, hoarse. "But how—" "The prescription bottles," she cut in, gesturing toward the beat-up backpacks slumped like a forgotten soldier against the wall. "They're labeled." Back on the line, her voice hardened. "Yes, I'm still holding. No, I'm not transferring. He's standing in front of me. I can verify his military status. I've seen the card. He has the bearing. He has the scars. What more do you want? A notarized ghost of Reagan?" A woman in a camel hair coat pushed her way to the front of the crowd, eyes wide with self-importance. "Madam AG," she chirped, performing concern like it was a TED Talk. "Can we help? I work in the mayor's office." Letitia didn't even look up. "You can help," she said evenly, "by giving us some space." The woman melted backward, like hypocrisy in heels. James tried to steady his breathing. His pulse had its own ideas. This morning, he'd been an invisible relic on the corner of Lenox and 124th. Now he was being interrogated, not by police, but by a prosecutor with a purpose. Letitia turned to him again, this time softer. "Mr. Walker, I'm going to ask you a few questions. They're personal, but they matter." James nodded slowly, unsure if his legs would outlast his answers. "When was your last full medical checkup?" 3 months ago. VA said the heart needs watching," he admitted, looking away. "I lost my job after that." Letitia didn't interrupt. She didn't flinch. She didn't offer the fake empathy cocktail of head tilts and vague affirmations. She just listened. Real listening. The kind that makes most politicians nervous because it obligates them to act. They didn't want to keep a guard with a heart problem on payroll. "I get it," he added, shrugging in a way that was supposed to look fine but didn't. "What was your MOS?" "Military police. 22 years. Staff sergeant before Desert Storm. After that, civilian security. Until—" He gestured at his chest like it was a failed system report. Letitia nodded, tapping into the tablet. "Military police, plus civilian security training." She turned her head slightly, speaking into her phone again. "Yes, that's correct. I have a role in mind. He's not dead weight. He's qualified. He's been overlooked long enough." James stared at her. She didn't blink. And somewhere between the buzzing phones and the frozen fingers and the chaos of city life pretending not to see what it created, something began to shift, not just around them, but under them. This wasn't charity. This was accountability. This wasn't a photo op. This was policy, enacted in real time by someone who remembered why she ran in the first place. Letitia James didn't pause to smile for cameras. She didn't look for applause. She didn't hand James a slogan on a flyer. She took notes. She cross-checked protocols. She acted like someone who knew the legal code and chose to apply it to a living person instead of a spreadsheet. And as she held the phone with one hand, the future in the other, and the cold wrapped around them like a dare, James realized something horrifying and beautiful. He might matter again. The wind returned like a final insult. It tore down 125th Street, as if the city itself had grown impatient with the idea of kindness and came back to restore the natural order of indifference. James flinched, teeth chattering, shoulders hunched. But Letitia James didn't miss a beat. Still on her call, likely navigating the maze of bureaucrats who think urgent is a threat to their lunch break, she did something that made her staff visibly squirm. She removed her scarf. Not just any scarf. A deep burgundy wool, clearly handmade. The kind of item you don't just buy, you inherit. She stepped forward, eyes never leaving James's, and draped it around his neck. Her team shifted in visible discomfort. One aide cleared his throat like he was allergic to spontaneous humanity. Another glanced at the cameras with the panic of a man who feared a headline that didn't involve strategic optics, or at least a press release. "Madam AG, that's really not—" But Letitia silenced him with a look that could level a hedge fund. James began to protest. "Ma'am, that's—" "No," she interrupted, still balancing her phone to her ear. "I have another coat. You don't have another winter." The words landed harder than intended. James reached up with trembling fingers and clutched the scarf, not because it warmed him immediately, but because for the first time in months he felt covered, protected, not just from the weather, but from whatever this city had become. She pressed the phone against her shoulder. "Mr. Walker," she said quietly, "I know this is strange. I know you didn't wake up this morning expecting any of this, but life's funny that way. My father used to say, 'The law protects the strong. Compassion protects the rest of us.' My mother would have added, 'And the government should be doing both, or what the hell are we paying for?'" The scarf was far too long for him. Letitia, despite the courtroom composure, stood a good 6 inches taller. But somehow on James's shoulders it didn't feel borrowed. It felt earned. "Back on the line," Letitia nodded. "Yes, I'm still here. Please connect me to HR. No, I'm not holding again. You've had 4 budget cycles to digitize this department. Today, you'll learn urgency the hard way." She turned back to James. "Just a few more minutes, Mr. Walker. This will be worth your time." And for once, someone said that to him without trying to sell him something. The crowd had begun to dissipate, like New Yorkers always do once the novelty fades. A few diehards remained, phones still recording, hoping to catch a viral quote, or maybe the moment she ruined someone on live camera. James stood straighter. Not just from warmth, but from something older. From memory. From pride. For the first time since he'd lost his job, since his benefits turned into a paperwork pit, since his existence became a case number instead of a name, he felt something dangerous again. Dignity. Letitia, now juggling her phone and tablet like it was just another deposition, continued typing with surgical precision. One staffer leaned in to whisper something about her next engagement. She didn't blink. "This is important," she said flatly. "Everything else can wait." James watched her. No, studied her, the way he used to watch officers under pressure. Calm, controlled, directing energy, not absorbing it. If Michael had lived, he might have grown into someone like this. Someone who didn't need to announce they were in charge, because everyone in the room already knew. Letitia's voice sharpened. "Yes, thank you for taking my call. I'm reviewing the candidate's background now. Military police, 22 years. Civilian security post-retirement. Heart condition noted, but not disqualifying. She paused. Yes, I understand the position requirements. No, I think he's perfect for it. You want institutional loyalty, street-level experience, and someone who's already stared into the face of a system that nearly killed him and still wants to serve? Then you're not going to find anyone more qualified than the man freezing in front of me. James barely breathed. Another murmur rippled through the remaining crowd. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, the kind that screams government, but hopes to whisper prestige. Two more security personnel stepped out, scanning the scene with textbook precision. One approached Letitia, leaned in to speak. She didn't flinch, didn't step away from James. She simply covered the microphone and turned to him. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I need about 10 more minutes to finish these calls. Would you be willing to wait in the car where it's warm? My team will stay with you, and I give you my word. This isn't a ploy to make you leave. You have my name, and I don't make promises I can't litigate." James glanced at the SUV, then back at her face. In a past life, or just yesterday, he would have refused, would have clung to pride like it was his final possession. But now, with her scarf around his shoulders and the weight of her voice behind him, he remembered something Sarah once said when they'd helped a stranger on the subway. Sometimes God shows up late, but he doesn't come empty-handed. "Yes," James said, stronger now. "Yes, I'll wait." The SUV's interior felt impossibly warm, as though leather and climate control had been invented by angels with a thing for public service. He eased into the seat, then froze, afraid his coat would soil the cushions. But the guard who opened the door, Johnson, according to the earpiece chatter, just nodded and said, "Make yourself comfortable, Sergeant." That word, Sergeant, hit different when spoken with respect. Through the tinted window, James saw her pacing outside, still on the phone, tablet in hand. A new coat had been fetched and thrown over her shoulders like a cape of executive defiance. "Would you like some water, sir?" Johnson asked, holding out a bottle. James accepted, trying not to guzzle it like instinct demanded. His hands shook less. His breath steadied. Letitia's scarf still clung to his neck like a second skin. Outside, she smiled faintly at something she was hearing. Gave a small thumbs up. One of her team peeled away, making another call. Coordination. Activation. Not charity. For the first time in months, James Walker was no longer part of the city's forgotten inventory. And for the first time in years, someone powerful didn't treat him like a risk or a burden or a cautionary tale. They treated him like a man worth preparing for. When Letitia James finally returned to the SUV, she didn't arrive like a politician checking a box. She arrived like a woman who had just quietly rearranged the gears of a government system built to stall. Her coat still fluttered slightly from the cold, her face flushed, not from the weather, but from the high of doing something unscripted in a profession where spontaneity is considered a liability. She opened the door, stepped in, and sat across from James as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Walker," she said, voice even, tablet already back in hand. "I've made some arrangements, if you're willing to hear them." James nodded. Barely. His throat was dry again, but this time not from hunger or shame. It was the surreal weight of watching the morning fold into something that resembled possibility. "First," Letitia began scrolling, "there's a room waiting for you at the Midtown Housing Initiative Hotel 3 blocks from here. It's prepaid through a fund we set up after the shelter embezzlement scandal. Funny how corruption leaves behind some very useful loopholes. Anyway, the address is yours for the next 30 days. No forms, no conditions, just a key, a door, and maybe, eventually, some sleep. James's mouth opened, but no sound followed. Second, she continued, not missing a beat, the Office of Public Safety just confirmed an opening for a part-time security consultant at our Harlem site. Desk-based, review protocols, train recruits. No running, no stairs, no panic buttons. Just your experience, put to better use than it's been in years. They'd like to meet you at 2 o'clock. I've already sent over your background. They're impressed. Tears welled, uninvited. He blinked hard, willing them back. I don't know what to say. I'm not finished. Of course she wasn't. Third, Letitia said, tapping again. You have an appointment tomorrow morning with the Manhattan VA. Full cardiac workup. Paid for by a non-profit we manage under something called the Equal Path Initiative. Created it 2 years ago to assist veterans who get caught in the system's revolving door of paperwork and pity. They'll also expedite your housing file and reclassify your application as high urgency, which, given your service and current situation, it always should have been. A laugh sob escaped James's throat. He caught it with his hand, then tried to explain the unexplainable. Why? Why do all this? Letitia looked at him, not with pity, not with the self-congratulatory gleam of a lawmaker reading her own press release, but with the calm seriousness of someone who knows she won't be praised for this by the New York Times and couldn't care less. Because you reminded me of what public service is supposed to look like, she said. You didn't ask me to fix your life. You asked for $1, and that's what made it impossible to ignore. People who game the system usually show up with a lawyer and a press strategy. You showed up with integrity, a frayed coat, a military ID, and manners. She swiped again, then paused. I've been watching you. You kept your sidewalk clean. You helped a woman pick up groceries she dropped. You didn't panhandle. You gave directions to strangers while starving. You carried yourself with the kind of discipline the city budget never learned to respect. And you were willing to break your own code to ask for help. Not because you wanted to, but because you had no choice. That's not weakness, Mr. Walker. That's moral clarity. James wanted to protest, to explain that it was too much, to insist she give these things to someone more deserving, which, let's be honest, was usually code for someone more publicly pitiable. But then he heard Michael's voice again. If we can help but don't, what does that make us? Letitia reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a business card. Plain, black ink on white stock. She held it out like a verdict. This is my direct office line. Not the press office, not the PR team, not a hotline monitored by interns and dread. If anything about these arrangements falls apart, you call me. You won't need to, but it'll feel good knowing you could. Outside, the city didn't stop. It never does. Phones buzzed, horns honked. Pedestrians passed like nothing had happened. And why would they notice? In New York, transformation is always someone else's headline. But in the SUV's soft interior, James Walker sat wrapped in a wool scarf he hadn't asked for, holding a card he never thought he'd touch, looking at a woman who'd spent the last hour unbreaking something no city office had ever dared fix, a man's belief that the government might remember his name. Hope, ma'am, James said quietly, emotion creeping into the edges of his voice. This feels like hope. Letitia's expression softened. My mother used to say that hope is just justice taken the scenic route. James shook his head. Number this, what you did today, this is what my Michael would have done. He always saw people, really saw them, just like you did. Letitia nodded, then glanced back at the tablet. "The hotel's expecting you. You'll have a hot meal waiting. A new suit is being delivered to the front desk. It'll fit better than my scarf, I promise. And that interview at 2? You'll walk into it not as a favor, not as a charity case, but as the most qualified man in the room." James looked down at the card in his hand, fingers tracing the embossed seal. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "You already did," Letitia replied gently. "You reminded me why I do this. All you asked for was $1. But what you gave me was a reason to say yes when the system expects silence." As the SUV pulled away, James looked through the back window at the patch of sidewalk he used to call home. His cardboard square was still there, flattened, wind-blown, anonymous. But he wasn't going back to it. Not today. Sarah would understand. And Michael would be proud. Not just of a father who found the courage to ask, but of a public servant who didn't walk away when it mattered. The SUV slowed in front of a gleaming mid-rise. A doorman appeared like clockwork. "Ready, Mr. Walker?" Letitia asked, and for the first time in years he didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said, stepping out into the next chapter. "Yes, I'm ready." James straightened his shoulders, the scarf around his neck no longer a borrowed kindness but a banner reclaimed. No longer cold. No longer background noise. No longer some discarded statistic in a bureaucrat's quarterly failure report. "Yes," he said, firmly, clearly, like a man reintroducing himself to a world that had prematurely written his obituary. "Yes, I'm ready." And he meant it. Not in the saccharine campaign slogan way politicians like to print on bus ads, but in the quiet, defiant way that says, "I'm still here, and I remember who I used to be." He was ready to accept help, not as a beggar but as a citizen, ready to rebuild, not with empty platitudes but with practical structure, ready to honor Michael, not through grief therapy brochures or ceremonial flags mailed after the fact, but by mirroring the boy's decency with actions of his own. Because in a city where officials spend more time scheduling press conferences about justice than practicing it, something had actually changed. And it didn't come from a memo. It came from a moment. One simple question. Could you spare $1? Had cracked through the concrete of cynicism and revealed something we rarely admit exists in high office anymore. Moral courage. Not the performative kind. Not the kind you Instagram with a non-profit backdrop and a folded check. But the kind that makes staffers nervous and lobbyists irrelevant. The kind that shows up in a scarf, a phone call, and a refusal to step over someone just because it's easier than stepping in. Letitia James didn't save James Walker. That's the wrong headline. She saw him. In a political climate obsessed with demographics and poll-tested empathy, she bypassed the algorithm and spoke like a human being with institutional power, and an institutional memory of what power is actually for. Because in this glorious, dysfunctional, soundbite-saturated democracy of ours, there are still rare officials who understand that a homeless veteran is not a public nuisance, but a living indictment of every system that failed to see him. And when those rare officials stop to act, not because it's convenient, but because it's right, the impact doesn't disappear with the news cycle. It echoes. So James didn't just walk into a hotel lobby. He walked into the fight for his own redemption, with his back straighter, his voice clearer, and the quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, this city hadn't given up on men like him. Letitia didn't wave, didn't pose. She simply nodded once, the way prosecutors do after they've just delivered the truth and don't need applause. The SUV pulled away from the curb, gliding back into a city that hadn't earned the moment it just witnessed. And on the sidewalk, James Walker's cardboard square remained, empty, folded, irrelevant now. Because the man who used to sit on it had traded invisibility for intention, and he had no plans of looking back. So, if you made it this far, congratulations. Your soul isn't dead yet. Maybe it flickered a little when James asked for $1. Maybe it burned brighter when Letitia didn't flinch. Either way, stories like this don't trend. They don't fit neatly into viral clips or partisan brawls. But they matter. And in a world that too often rewards cruelty disguised as efficiency, this story is your reminder that justice isn't just a courtroom outcome or a headline buzzword. It's a choice, a moment, a refusal to ignore the obvious. So tell us where you're listening from. New York, Georgia, Idaho, maybe somewhere far beyond the chaos. Have you ever witnessed a moment like this? Quiet, inconvenient, and absolutely essential. We want to hear it, because your stories are proof that compassion isn't weakness. It's the only kind of power that never needs permission.